There is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It shows up in the years before the 1970s stagflation crisis. It shows up in the lead up to 2008, and it is showing up right now, in real time, on the US government's own balance sheet. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a prediction. It is arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike Congress, does not negotiate. Here is the number you need to know. The United States is currently running a deficit of roughly $1.8 trillion per year. Not total debt, per year. Every 12 months, the government spends $1.8 trillion more than it collects and covers the gap by borrowing the difference, which is a polite way of saying it promises to deal with it later. Later, apparently, being someone else's problem. The total tab now sits at over $36 trillion. But big numbers alone are just big numbers. What matters is the pattern they create, and this pattern has a very consistent track record. It does not end well. First parallel, the late 1960s. The US government decided to fund the Vietnam War and a massive domestic spending expansion simultaneously. No cuts anywhere to offset either. By the early 1970s, inflation was climbing. The dollar was under pressure, and in 1971, the gold standard was abandoned entirely. Once the anchor was gone, inflation did not walk higher. It ran. By 1974, inflation hit 11%. By 1980, it hit 14.5%. The stock market lost 50% in real terms. And the average American watched their purchasing power get quietly destroyed over an entire decade, while Washington debated whose fault it was. Second parallel, the early 2000s. After the dot-com crash in September 11th, the government opened the fiscal taps. 2 wars, tax cuts, a new Medicare expansion, all at once. The deficit swung from a surplus of $236 billion in 2000, an actual surplus, remember those, to a deficit of $413 billion by 2004. To keep things moving, the Fed held rates at 1%, which flooded the system with cheap money looking for somewhere to go. It went into housing, and we all know how that ended. The mechanism is always the same. Deficit spending forces borrowing. Borrowing floods the system with liquidity. Liquidity chases returns into increasingly speculative assets. Leverage builds up quietly in places nobody is watching until it snaps. Which brings us to right now. The US is not running a $1.8 trillion deficit because of a war or a pandemic. This is just the baseline now. Interest payments on the national debt alone now exceed $1 trillion annually, more than the entire defense budget. And that number grows automatically every time debt gets refinanced at higher rates. This is the trap with no clean exit. If rates stay high, the interest burden keeps growing. If rates get cut aggressively, inflation reignites. If the government tries to close the gap through cuts or tax hikes, it risks choking off the growth the whole system depends on. Every exit has a cost, and history says the cost that gets chosen is always the one that hits regular people's savings and purchasing power the hardest, because it is the most politically invisible until it is already too late. So what do you actually do with this? Own assets that do not depend on dollar stability. Real estate, commodities, equities in companies with genuine pricing power. These have historically held value far better than cash during periods of fiscal stress. Cash feels safe. In an inflationary environment, cash is where purchasing power goes to die quietly. And stop waiting for a political solution. Both sides of the aisle have contributed equally to this balance sheet for 2 decades straight. This is not a political problem. It is a structural problem with a mathematical timeline. And the timeline is getting shorter. Here's the gut punch. Every single time this pattern has played out, the people in charge said the same thing. That the deficit was manageable, that growth would close the gap, that this time the math was different. It was not different. So where do you land on this? Do you think this ends with A, a slow inflation cycle that quietly erodes purchasing power over a decade? B, a sharper market dislocation when bond markets finally lose patience? Or C, it somehow gets resolved before it becomes a real crisis, and this is all just noise? Drop your take in the comments. The debate down there is always more honest than anything on financial television.